Welcome to the Envision RISE podcast. I'm Staci Hegarty. I'm your host and the COO of Envision RISE. Joining me today is author Matthew Sekol. Matthew, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, we are excited to have you. A few weeks ago, we featured your book, ESG Mindset, Business Reliance and Sustainable Growth, on our RISE Reads features. And I thank you so much for responding to my LinkedIn request to come on the podcast and talk to us. Our ESG journey here at Envision RISE started when I was studying for the CFA ESG exam. And after reading that book, I picked up your book, and I wish I had done it in reverse order because it would have been a lot easier for me. But let's start with the basics. Tell us about yourself. How did you come into the ESG space? Because this is not where you started.
No, it's definitely not. So most of my career has been spent in IT. And eventually I joined Microsoft because Microsoft had always underpinned my career. And I joined in sales for the first time. And I was aligned with financial services. And I was talking with it was all the biggest asset managers, the biggest private equity firms, and the biggest ESG data aggregators. And this was maybe like 2018, 2019, just as the Business Roundtable had kind of shifted their stance on shareholder primacy and Larry Fink was writing his letters. And I'm like, what is this ESG thing? And I looked at it and I was just fascinated by it, completely fascinated because there were no clear answers. It required like complex thinking skills. And so I started to pursue it. And because I was in sales, I would talk about mostly our cloud and data. And then when the opportunity came to join a team focused on sustainability here from a commercial perspective, I jumped at it. Because what I found was I was focused on financial services and ESG, but companies weren't getting it. And I would talk to chief investment officers, portfolio managers, and they would say things. And I would say to them, I don't think the companies that you're investing in really understand what you're talking about. Because what I see them doing is this entirely different thing. So that's what led me to write the book and everything else. Yeah.
Let's start really basic. What is ESG? What do those letters stand for? Because when I talk about it to people, I get kind of a blank look and people are trying to fill in those letters for themselves. So what is it?
Yes. So usually in popular vernacular, what it stands for is environmental, social, and corporate governance. But really, the media and companies, and even some financial services firms, kind of attribute any sort of E, S, or G issue to that term. When in reality, it started off as in 2004 as kind of a concept for financial investors to drive capital around companies that were dealing with their environmental, social, and governance issues well. And by that, I mean the ones that had a material effect on the company. So it wasn't so much about maybe, and this is where it gets nuanced, it wasn't so much about the impact of the company out to the world, but the impact of the world and its people back on the company. So this is the difference between, now putting aside things like fines, this is the difference between something like pollution, which has a very negative impact, and it's still a material issue because of fines and everything else, and something like a hurricane that comes through and wipes out your factory. Like, so there's a lot of nuance to it, but ultimately what I always lead with are two things. One is materiality. So does it matter to the company? And then the second thing is, will addressing that risk or creating that opportunity generate some sort of long-term growth or resilience? Because that's the other big piece of it. What I find is whenever I read about ESG, there's usually a definition in the beginning because people define it very differently.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that's actually a bit of a problem for ESG. So when I was studying for the exam, I got really down a rabbit hole with double materiality, which is the impact of the environment, usually, on the business and the impact of the business on the environment. But I really struggled with, what do I do with this information? How do we measure this information? How do you know if an organization is doing ESG well? And I kept thinking, okay, I'm 200 pages in on the 600-page book. Maybe by page 300, I'll understand, and there will be a formula, and it will make this all so clear. And it never happened.
No, and I think that is a big problem that ESG has. So, like just like the pollution example I gave, or I was talking with somebody about forced labor this morning. There are all sorts of ways that these impact issues, which is part of double materiality, can blow back on a company from fines or reputational risk and suddenly become a material ESG issue. But it's extremely hard to figure out like which one of those things might it be,
Mhm.
and how do you deal with it all. And what I find is the best way that I've found to kind of figure out what companies are doing is to look at their impact, sustainability, ESG report, whatever they call it, and try to look at the projects that they're talking about and then think about the business. And does that matter to the business? So, for example, one of the examples I call out in my book is from Dell, where they went into they started a program for high schoolers to become their high school tech support. And they offered Dell certification classes. Now, that is a great social initiative that has a clear social benefit to those high schools where those programs are run. But it also helps Dell. Like it is a material issue back to Dell because if they have Dell engineers out there who go to work in corporate wherever, they suddenly might be like, hey, you know what? We're using HP. Maybe we should use Dell, or we're
Mhm.
using Apple. Maybe we should use Dell. Like this becomes an issue back to the company through that. So definitely nuanced, definitely hard to figure out. I think I've become pretty good at it because there's a lot of projects in those CSR reports that are more clearly philanthropy than, actually trying to manage some sort of risk or create an opportunity. And that's the one thing that's kind of like the bar is that
Mhm.
philanthropic perspective, but then above that everything becomes really complicated.
And you mentioned CSR. So for our listeners who may not know what that acronym is, corporate social responsibility, right?
Right.
What's
Yep.
the difference between ESG and CSR?
Yeah, so CSR has been around for decades, and it was really, oh gosh, it was really created more for companies to communicate some of their efforts, not really around what I defined as ESG, but what were they doing to create a social benefit. But now, what it's become since ESG is a mix of all kinds of different things. And again, this gets back to the first question you asked. It is every E, S, or G thing, and sometimes even technology. I do see that coming in
Mhm.
more often, especially like cybersecurity and AI. Here are all the non-financial things that we're doing that you should know. Whatever it is, here it is, and here's our CSR. So that's
So
that's kind of the difference.
so what I'm seeing from ESG right now is that it's kind of become the organizational junk drawer for all the stuff that isn't our brand new product sold this much. And
Yes.
even then, it gets really complicated when we're looking at disclosures because while there is some comparability, there's not really. Like, there's not a structure, there's not a specific form that you fill out, and everybody fills out this form, and this is how we measure your ESG factors. So, when we look at ESG from an investment standpoint, that's one thing,
Yeah.
and they're looking for certain things, and there are all these ratings things you can look up online, and they kind of give you an idea of ESG risk. But for a company, we're not talking about the investors, we're talking about how does the company do ESG, because what we don't want is people studying for the exam, like we want organizations to figure out what their ESG values actually are. And in your book, I think you talk about kind of values versus value. And if you could expound on that a little bit, what should companies be looking at when they're talking ESG as opposed to what investors are looking at?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And it's kind of hard to answer without talking about investors because the round of disclosures that everybody is dealing with is really to create that comparable data that you're talking about for investors to do the analysis. But there's huge challenges with it. So if I'm a company, what I need to think about are what are my most material issues? Like do an examination top to bottom of the business and say, from this new lens that is not financial necessarily, what are my environmental, social, and governance risks? And what are the opportunities? And whether that involves competitive analysis or not, that's something that the company can decide and kind of plot them out on a materiality matrix and the top right issues are typically the ones that you deal with. Now, the other critical part of that are stakeholders. And what a lot of people miss about stakeholders is that there are stakeholder groups, really, like employees or customers. But within those categories, there are subcategories of stakeholders that you really need to pay attention to. And they'll have all kinds of different opinions on what you should be doing, why they buy your product, whether it's a B2B relationship or a B2C relationship. So you really have to understand, what do these stakeholders want and what are their expectations of you? There may be stakeholders that prefer sustainability or prefer DE&I. And then there may be stakeholders that don't prefer those things. And how do you balance that? Which is, again, why I love this topic, because I love figuring this stuff out. But I think it's important for companies to realize that the reporting and disclosures have one function, which is to provide financial services firms with comparable data to make an investment decision. That is the job of the disclosures. You need to take that information and layer it back into your business and see what matters. I always talk about Netflix and Disney because they're both similar. Like if you take the streaming service, you could probably compare Netflix and Disney Plus, let's say. But once you get past that, they are way different companies. They both have licensing and IP, but then Disney has its parks. It has clearly like different things going on that it has to deal with. So like how could you ever get like, and why would you ever compare carbon emissions from Netflix and Disney? Why would that ever be a
Right.
thing for an investor? So like if you're Disney and Netflix, you should think about other things like, how am I putting out diverse content? Am I making sure I'm growing my audience through that means? Am I, energy usage for a streaming service is a material issue. Maybe I am sourcing renewable energy or not. And maybe there is a carbon need there that could be a reputational risk. But like an all up carbon number for those firms, it doesn't matter. So it's super difficult, I think, for companies to kind of navigate this right now because they have the disclosures and then they have the issues that matter to the company most. And how do you know which ones to prioritize
Mhm.
across all of it is a huge challenge.
And then what this leads to is confusion at the board and executive level. That, people like you and I say, you should really be paying attention to your ESG factors, not just for your disclosures, but for the outcomes of your company. And then they look at us and go, oh, good, another squishy thing for me to follow. Sure, maybe I can pay attention to my carbon output, greenhouse gas emissions, maybe, if we're not greenwashing our numbers. So, what do you say to the G piece of ESG when we say you need to be doing this because it matters? And they say, okay, what do we do?
Yeah. I often think of the G in terms of table stakes because the disclosures are very much table stakes, especially for American companies. Like we have SOX, we have GDPR in the EU that you have to comply with. There are certainly compliance pieces as well as reporting pieces that you just have to do. But there are benefits in doing that. Not only do you avoid fines, there could be reputational advantages to doing that. But from an executive and board perspective, they really have to move the conversation past that. Like their role is to know the business best. And in order to intersect with ESG and manage these risks and opportunities well, they have to actively think about it, which is why towards the end of the book, I kind of argue it doesn't really matter what we call this, but it kind of does because boards are not familiar with these three things
Right.
specifically. And with quarterly reporting cycles here in the US, especially, they don't have that long term view often. And you see it where it manifests a lot is in proxy statements, because you'll see these ESG resolutions come up, and sometimes they're impact focused, sometimes they are ESG focused, sometimes you can't tell what it is. But the board, like I would wager not over 9 times out of 10 is like recommending not to vote on them. But I don't know that that's necessarily fair because while companies are making strides and doing efforts in the E and the S and sometimes the G areas, investors have a right to ownership to make those suggestions. And sometimes the investors have pretty good ideas that are at least worth a consideration. And maybe say, I don't read a ton of proxy statements, but I've never seen a proxy statement that says, you know what, this is a good point. Don't vote for this, but here's what we're going to do instead. Because here's where it matters to the company. Why that is such a horrible thing, I have no idea. It seems perfectly like a reasonable approach to me rather than shutting down, hey, we're not going to, you know what, a racial equity audit? Nope. I did a racial equity audit's interesting. I did see one, there was a key bank was threatened with a racial equity audit around their mortgages, and they decided to do it themselves without it coming up for a proxy vote. So there are ways that companies do that, but man, you really got to pay attention to that piece. And as the board, that is your job.
Well, it does do my heart good to know you're not just sitting around reading proxies. I'm happy to hear that. All right, so now we're going to talk about the S, and this is the one that makes people a little bit itchy. So
Yeah.
I think most organizations are reasonably comfortable with we need to do the things that are environmentally conscious in some ways. Now, whether or not they're going far enough, that's a whole different discussion. The governance piece, we've seen many organizations taken down by the lack of ethical governance. I mean, anybody remember Enron? That's all you have to say, and people go, oh. Let's talk the social piece, because I think this is where sometimes people get a little wrapped around the axle, that this is more than you did a good job not getting sued for an HR violation this year. What else is in that S piece?
Oh my gosh, the S piece. So I once heard a story that the S is in the middle because when they were originally thinking about it, they were worried it was going to fall off the end of the acronym. I don't know if that's true or not, but I have heard that story told. The S is tough because it's all around people. And the way that I center it in the book is really around stakeholders. It tends to go, and I think the E has this challenge as well. The E and the S have specific systemic challenges that we need to address as a world. And for the E, it's lowering carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. It's making sure we're protecting biodiversity and water. For the S, especially in the US, it is largely about diversity, equity, and inclusion because there are undoubtedly systemic issues around those challenges. And I think people do, they get wrapped up in what does diversity, equity, and inclusion mean, and how does it intersect with us materially? And it's a really tough question. I have my personal beliefs, which is that we should support those efforts. Whether or not I think one company can solve a systemic issue is another question, because I don't think that they can. And then you get into issues like, can industry players work together on DE&I? Because while that might solve a systemic issue, it might be an antitrust issue. It is really, really hard.
Mhm.
So, what I always try to recommend is to take a look at it from the stakeholder approach. What matters to your stakeholders? And I think we saw this the way that I wrote about it, and I did write about it in the book, but I've also written about it in my newsletter, is the Bud Light example. Bud Light made a terrible miscalculation on what its stakeholders would do in the other way.
Mhm.
They thought their stakeholders would embrace inclusion, and they clearly did not. Now, granted, there's all sorts of factors around that ended up kind of being a non-issue, but in the end, but it's as complicated as people are.
Mhm.
Yeah, and there are no easy answers.
And when you're looking at not just the organization, but all the vendors, all the suppliers,
Yeah,
all those other pieces, those upstream pieces, then you start looking at the S even a little bit differently. That are you buying your raw materials from an organization that uses child labor or is
yeah.
not fairly compensating their employees? And what does that do? And how do you recommend an organization go about looking at their suppliers through an ESG lens?
Yeah, that's a really good question because besides the forced labor issue, let me give you another example that I often talk about. In this chase for carbon disclosures, what ends up happening is companies will say things like, show me my top three carbon emitting suppliers. And then they look at their goals and they say, well, if we cut those top three and went with a lower carbon supplier, we would meet our goal. And let's do that. And what they don't realize is that those top three suppliers may be in the global south without access to renewable energy. They may be forced people who are struggling with forced labor. And in the end, they cut those three suppliers and they've saved nothing and no one,
Mhm.
because those three suppliers might be picked up by somebody else. It might plunge the local region into some sort of political uncertainty if you happen to be one of the bigger B2B customers there. What I would encourage companies to do when they're looking at suppliers specifically is look at it through the lens of ESG. Like try, and I talk about this in the book. through an interconnected lens perspective. What is going on locally? Now, if in the case of forced labor, there is absolutely no silver bullet there. And depending on the size of the company that we're talking about here, not the supplier, but the company, I would engage local governments, make sure that your audits are being done regularly, and listen to your stakeholders. Like, if your employees are surfacing concerns about your supply chain, or if your investors are surfacing concerns about your supply chain, or if consumers are going out to social media and blasting you, which happens in fashion all the time, like,
Mhm.
you should probably at least do more than what you're doing. Because if you think you're doing audits and you're doing some other checks and balances, maybe you're clearly not at least telling your story right if stakeholders are still coming to you and saying, do you really know what's happening on the ground here? And figure that out. Like, how can you better or more effectively tell the story and actually do the thing? Like, you
Mhm.
have to still do the thing. You can't just say, we're doing these audits, blah, blah, blah. You have to be transparent in some of this stuff, especially when it comes to issues like forced labor. That is such a difficult topic to tackle. Now, if you're a big company, highly encourage you to work with like public private partnerships in the countries in which you operate and things like that. Not everybody can do that though.
Yep. So, last question I have is, where do you see ESG? What's the role of ESG in the future of work? And I ask for a lot of reasons, but one of them is I've got a 15-year-old daughter who is very into fashion. When she started hearing about forced labor at some of her favorite retailers, she stopped shopping there. She's 15. So she is just now starting to really embrace what's going on in the world around her. What does ESG mean for employers in the future?
You know what? That's such a great question. I don't know that I've ever been asked that question actually. And I see it. I have kids that are also teenagers and I see the same thing. What I'd say is this: not every day, but pretty much every day, I get pings from people on LinkedIn, usually like yourself, and they want to have conversations about bringing purpose into their work. They're like, Matt, I looked at your LinkedIn profile. You were in IT and now you work at sustainability at
Mhm.
Microsoft. Like, how did that happen? Because out of COVID and out of the extreme weather events that I'm seeing in the world today, I realize that the world is changing and I am filled with a sense of purpose, and help me get that purpose in my work. And I'm seeing that more and more. What's funny is I'm seeing it, I am having some conversations with students that, like, it's starting to skew younger, to your point, younger and younger and younger. And people are like, hey, I'm about to graduate. Hey, I just entered college. I actually mentor a high school student who has a sustainable fast fashion brand because she's interested in this topic. I don't think companies are ready, honestly. I really feel like the next decade is going to be really transformative. Where, to your question earlier about governance, boards are really going to have to look at what they're doing. And look, not everybody can have a purpose filled job, but this, chances are that one of these three pillars has an intersection with everybody's
Mhm.
job at your company. So you got to figure out what it is and how do you empower those people to act on the company's purpose and their personal purpose. Absolutely, I don't think it's going away. And what I think companies are going to find is the talent is going to go where the companies are getting this right. And I can't tell you how many people want to, like, most people are like, hey, I want to come work at Microsoft to do sustainability. And I'm like, all right, slow your roll. I get it. But have you thought about how you could do this in your existing work? But yeah, I don't think it's going away.
You mentioned that boards are really going to need to be paying attention to this, especially in the next decade. I would say, hey, boards, it's later than you think. This younger generation, they're either getting ready to graduate high school soon or they're graduating college now. And from what I can tell, they care about this. They care about the environment. They care about social issues. They care about working for a company that they feel is being run ethically, and that they don't have to wake up one morning, open TikTok, and go, oh my gosh, my company is out there and it's not for a good thing.
That's the thing. Imagine you have, I'm Gen X, and I can tell you this goes across all age
Mhm.
groups really anymore. There are purpose filled employees who you can channel that energy into something that matters to your business
Right.
across all three pillars. Like, imagine the power of that. Get an edge on your competitors, address a climate risk. Like it is mind boggling to me how boards are not channeling the energy that's out there today.
Uh, all baby boomers are going to be at retirement age by 2030. There are not enough Gen Xers to fill their roles. So, what are you going to do? And you've got to make yourself really attractive in ways that we haven't had to do before. It,
Hmm.
and, social media is so uncontrollable. And if you've got something going on in your organization that is a problem, it's going to be out there before you can even control the spin.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you take a look at your ESG issues through those two things I mentioned, materiality and the
Mhm.
long term, you will find defensibility in the other things that you want to do. Whether you choose to take on an impact to the world, you will find defensibility by dealing with your business first.
Well, on that note, Matthew Sekol, where can people reach you? Obviously, LinkedIn.
Yeah, I'm all over LinkedIn. I'd be surprised if you haven't seen me. I'm active out there, but feel free to ping me on LinkedIn. I check it regularly. You can also check esg-mindset.com for my book. I write a Substack called the esgadvocate.substack.com. It's pretty much every week anymore. So yeah, feel free to reach out to me through any of those means.
Well, we thank you so much for joining us today. I could have had this conversation go on for hours, but I don't think our listeners want to listen for hours. But I definitely want to have you back on. We'll talk some more in the future. Thank you again, Matthew. And if you'd like more information about Envision Rise, you can find us at envisionrise.com.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. And so with your help, we can get this message to more people. Subscribe, rate, and review the show, and be a part of making a difference, because it starts with you.